Hi, I'm Eddie Muller. At least, I look like Eddie Muller. Today's film is a reminder to not always take people at face value, especially when they stray into Noir Alley. Released by MGM in 1957, House of Numbers tells the story of Bill and Arnie Judlow, brothers on opposite sides of a prison wall. Arnie is in for manslaughter, and Bill orchestrates a break-in so that he can switch places with his sibling. Now, you might reasonably wonder how such a wild plan is supposed to work, and the answer is simple. Arnie and Bill are identical twins. They're both played by Jack Palance, so they both prove to be a lot more unstable than they initially seem. We'll let the Cain and Abel comparisons write themselves. House of Numbers has a B-movie pedigree, but what makes it unique is the top-flight talent this production managed to attract. Russell Rouse had already been nominated for an Oscar when he signed on to direct, and he was in the midst of a great run of 1950s noir. In addition to co-writing the classic DOA, Rouse wrote and directed such unique films as The Well, The Thief, Wicked Woman, and New York Confidential. The latter two have played previously on Noir Alley. Not only was Rouse a double threat as a writer and director, he was careful about never repeating himself. Each of his films was distinctive, and with House of Numbers, he had the chance to put a fresh spin on a prison yarn. He even got permission to shoot inside San Quentin, which cast such an ominous shadow over the proceedings that it feels like a character in its own right. Jack Palance was in the midst of a hot streak of his own. He had earned back-to-back supporting actor Oscar nominations for Sudden Fear and Shane. And in March 1957, he won an Emmy for his performance in Rod Serling's Requiem for a Heavyweight. He excelled at playing men who were their own worst enemies. And in this regard, House of Numbers is a perfect showcase for him. It's fun to watch Palance change his voice and mannerisms depending on which brother he's playing, especially when he's acting with himself, with special effects that are surprisingly good for the era. Palance would shoot the scenes one way, then switch places with stand-in Frank Watkins and play it the opposite way. It ain't Michael B. Jordan in Sinners, but it works. I also want to highlight the work of George J. Falsey, who has the unfortunate distinction of being the most nominated cinematographer to never win an Oscar. Talk about bad luck. In 1955, he was nominated twice for photographing Executive Suite and Seven Brides for Seven Brothers, and he still didn't get that damn statuette. The guy obviously was a genius at his craft, and his work on House of Numbers is especially good when you consider how minimal the settings are. Falsey manages to make prison cells and mess halls look textured and cinematic. There's a lot of emphasis on parallel lines, which make the audience feel as claustrophobic as the Judlow brothers. House of Numbers also features a score by legendary composer Andre Previn. He'd gotten his start at MGM in the late 40s, and by the time he made this film, he'd established himself as one of the premier composers in modern jazz. You might expect the score for House of Numbers to reflect a jazz influence, but Previn takes a more traditional string-heavy approach. The music teases out the melodrama, especially when the brothers' audacious plans start to go awry. With a terrific debut performance by Barbara Lang and bold opening credits by A. Arnold Gillespie and Lee LeBlanc, here is House of Numbers. House of Numbers was adapted from the novel of the same name written by Jack Finney, who's primarily known for sci-fi classics like Time and Again and Invasion of the Body Snatchers. The premise of this film is just as outlandish, to say the least, but the motivations of the Judlow brothers are actually based in fact. At the time of the film's release, assaulting a prison guard was a severely punishable offense. Even if the prisoner in question was serving time for a relatively minor offense, fighting with a guard could result in a life sentence, and nothing has changed. Jack Palance references the California Penal Code at one point, and the section detailing assault remains virtually identical today. So you could say the picture has aged well, at least in that regard. Fellow animal lovers may have noticed the cat strolling by Palance's prison cell, and that was no goof. San Quentin has a long history of feral cats roaming loose on the grounds, and the guards like having them around to control the rodent population. So that feline cameo actually lent authenticity to the proceedings. Another aspect of the film that's aged well is the supporting cast. Palance, of course, makes a meal out of his dual roles, but he often gets overshadowed by his fellow inmates. Joe Turkel bolstered his noir resume as Bradville, and the always inexplicable Timothy Carey pretty much walks away with the movie as Frenchie. Carey was a monster at scene stealing, but you'd be hard-pressed to find a performance of his as bewildering as this one. He's like a Dick Tracy villain come to life. Although I've watched this film multiple times, I still cannot make out half of his dialogue. Turkel and Carey had appeared together a year earlier in Stanley Kubrick's The Killing, and a few months after the release of House of Numbers, they would again appear together in Kubrick's anti-war masterpiece, Paths of Glory. Turkel also memorably played Lloyd, the bartender at the Overlook Hotel in Kubrick's The Shining. Harold J. Stone chewed up some of the sparse scenery as a crooked prison guard. He often played guys too stern for their own good, so it's fun to see him drop all the pretense and dominate both versions of Palance, a real rarity. Once his Hollywood star had waned, Palance spent years mugging through lots of Eurotrash, but he had one of the biggest comebacks of all time in the late 80s, culminating with his Oscar-winning performance in City Slickers, released in 1991. It's not noir, but it's worth mentioning here because when Palance returned 3 years later for the sequel, City Slickers 2, The Legend of Curly's Gold, he played the twin brother of his original character. See? It all comes full circle. The rest of the House of Numbers crew did similarly well for themselves. Russell Rouse went on to win an Oscar for co-screenwriting the story for the 1959 comedy Pillow Talk. Andre Previn eventually took home 4 Oscars and was only the second person to win Best Original Score in back-to-back years, and he did that twice. Poor George Folsey never got his cinematography Oscar, but he did get an Emmy for shooting the 1968 TV special Here's Peggy Fleming. Any of you remember Peggy Fleming? Despite all the collective talent involved, House of Numbers absolutely bombed on release, losing substantial dough for MGM. The New York Times ripped it to shreds, claiming that anyone who believed the plot would, quote, believe anything. Given our current state of affairs, such criticism doesn't have the same sting today. I also think it's an uncharitable assessment. Yeah, the plot is absurd, but the film has so much talent on both sides of the camera that it's hard not to be won over by its conviction. Everything in it is slightly off-kilter, and the cumulative effect sticks with you longer than any specific characters or scenes. Hundreds of prison noirs have been made over the years, but I can confidently say none of them are quite like House of Numbers. Next week, I'll be back right here at Bar 355 with a film featuring the most popular crime duo of the 1940s. Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake star in The Blue Dahlia, the only original story Raymond Chandler wrote for the movies. Until then, see you in the shadows.
Next on TCM, Watership Down, then The Seventh Victim, and later, The Breaking Point. TCM takes it to the limit today.